a lot of interest in wetlands. The neat thing is that in Grey Bruce, we are surrounded by them. Wherever we go, we see some of them, but we often don't even recognize them, which is a big issue.
So if we're thinking of wetlands that are hundreds to thousands of years in age and have been burying carbon for a really long time, it's really hard to replicate that.
Folks are, oh, I just want to take an acre. I just want to take a half acre here. It's just, it's just a little wetland. What does it matter on the grand scheme of things? Well, this is Walkerton in a snowmelt event, I believe, the exact same location, the exact same bridge. And you can see that any little impact on that watershed's ability to hold back water, which is what each wetland is doing, can have a significant impact downstream.
This is an election year, both municipal and provincial. So we need to keep wetlands in mind when we vote.
So certainly attend any of these all candidates meetings and raise your hand and get in there.
As we meet tonight to dive deep into wetlands and discuss their role within our biosphere and how we move forward tackling collectively our climate crisis and the many issues around it, we acknowledge that we gather on Indigenous land represented in our area by the Saugeen Ojibwe Nation, consisting of communities of Saugeen First Nation and the Chippewas of Nevash unceded First Nation on Neashe-Inikmi'in. We also recognize these as the lands of the Métis Nation of Ontario. And by gathering on these lands, we are all treaty people with all the relations and responsibilities that entails. I hope that these acknowledgements help us as we further develop a critical lens in our ways forward towards truth and reconciliation. Okay, with that, I hand it over to Leigh.
Thank you, Joachim. Yeah, we're very pleased to be doing a deep dive into wetlands this evening. This is Climate Forum, and we do every third Thursday. And tonight, our first speaker who's going to give an introduction will be Amanda Loder. And Amanda is a PhD candidate in physical geography at U of T, and she's a member of the Paleoecology Lab. Her research focuses on measuring carbon stocks in freshwater marsh soils in southern Ontario, and the capacity for marshes to sequester carbon and provide means for mitigating the climate crisis. So she also studies how land use and climate change affect all this carbon burial in marsh soils and the implications for wetland restoration and conservation. So Amanda's here in the room. She enjoys working, and currently she's she loves working with wetland conservationists. So she's in good company tonight with all our other panelists. As Joachim said, we'll have a couple of questions after each presenter's intro, and then at the very end, we'll let everyone weigh in and discuss why wetlands are important and why they should not be paved over and why they're valuable here. So our first guest is Amanda Loder. Thanks for joining us, Amanda.
Thank you for having me. I will share my screen now, and this should work since I did this in the technical setup. So thank you for the introduction, and thank you for the land acknowledgement. I'm really happy to be here tonight. As Leigh mentioned, I am a PhD candidate at the University of Toronto, and I work with Professor Sarah Finkelstein. And in our lab, we work on quantifying carbon in wetland soils and the role they provide in providing climate moderation. So today I will be focusing on how we use scientific research to inform natural climate solutions, which I will talk about in a little bit later, and to also provide the basics of the panel and the group discussion tonight on wetlands and the climate. So for those who are wondering, what are wetlands? Which is a really good question. Wetlands are, dynamic and complex ecosystems. So what they're most known for is, of course, being wet and having flooded soils. And these soils may be flooded all year round or sometimes only during certain parts of the year. And in these ecosystems, they support aquatic plants. And this aquatic plant growth is what ultimately drives, or is one of the main drivers of carbon burial in wetlands. So there are a couple of types of wetlands. We have bogs and fens, which are also known as peatlands. And these have more of your mosses and sphagnum, and they tend not to have any major inflows of water like a marsh, for example, which is more supported by herbaceous vegetation and tends to be found at transition zones between land and lake, land and sea, and land and rivers. And of course, we have swamps, which are wetlands that support trees. So wetlands are a diverse group of ecosystem, and I will say before we hone in Ontario, are worldwide. And they're found in different biomes, in different climates. I do put a plug in here for the Hudson Bay lowlands, as this is a large intact peatland in northern Ontario, right here in our province, and is one of the largest intact peatlands in the world. Now, over the last 2 centuries, there's been a major loss in wetlands. As I think was already briefly mentioned, wetlands have often been or were regarded as wastelands. And so upon European settlement in North America, for example, these lands were altered and destructed and still are today. Some of the reasons for altering and draining wetlands include to expand agriculture, so farmland, urban development, as well as road expansion. And this very much has occurred since you could say, has occurred as a result of colonialism. In Southern Ontario, more specifically, some counties have had more wetland loss than others, but we can see here that particularly in Southwestern Ontario, there's been losses of over 80% of wetlands since European settlement. You can look up here at the counties of Bruce and Grey, where you are all situated. So again, this is showing the percentage of wetland loss by county, and some have more than others, but we particularly see most lost in areas where there's been heavy agriculture. Now, what will be explained more by other presenters, of course, is the recognition of the important functions that wetlands provide, which can also be called ecosystem services. So, there's been increasing recognition of the importance of several functions that wetlands have that provide benefits to us and to, you could argue, society and to a healthy planet. So these include wildlife habitat, providing flood mitigation, providing nutrient sequestration to prevent eutrophication in, say, our lake ecosystems, and as well as carbon sequestration, which is what I'm going to focus on today. But as a result, in the last few decades, we have seen increasing conservation and restoration efforts, which have largely been driven by stakeholders such as those here today, but of course, as well as First Nations communities, which is really important to acknowledge. Okay, so coming to the role of wetlands in the biosphere and in terms of the climate. So why are wetlands, why are they burying carbon, and why are they so important in the realm of climate change? So when focusing on climate change, we often think of the carbon in the atmosphere. And so because of human activities that are driving emissions of greenhouse gases, this is causing increasing temperatures. So increasing greenhouse gases to the atmosphere is resulting in warming temperatures at a really high rate. Now, it's important to recognize, though, that there are other carbon reservoirs on our planet. And in these other carbon reservoirs, they are exchanging carbon with the atmosphere. So we have the ocean, terrestrial vegetation, and soils. And so these systems are interconnected. And so you may be looking at the ocean carbon amount there and saying, well, that is a really large amount, which of course it is. And what's been found is that the oceans tend to affect the climate in terms of their carbon over long periods of time. So over hundreds of thousands of years, or even over millions of years. But what's been of increasing interest is the role of terrestrial vegetation and soil in terms of the climate and their potential to play a role in amplifying anthropogenic induced climate change. Now, you may be looking at these carbon amounts and saying, well, that's quite a bit less than the ocean. But what we find is that terrestrial vegetation and soil has potential to be released at really rapid rates. And when looking at this in comparison to the atmosphere, it's nonetheless a lot of carbon that, if altered or drained, or if there's a wildfire, can get released to the atmosphere and have potential to amplify human-induced climate change. Now, of course, the soil and terrestrial vegetation is hard to quantify because it's quite variable in terms of the amounts that are being released and taken up over different timeframes. Now, I do just want to quickly mention here about the importance of soil carbon in Canada and in Ontario. So in my last slide here, we mentioned terrestrial vegetation. And I know this is a bit of you could say a scientific map, but I just want you to take note that in terms of the lower map with biomass density, this is referring to carbon that's in vegetation that's above ground. So when we think of vegetation above ground, we often think of the tropical rainforest, as you can see down here in Brazil, which has a really dense color showing a lot of the carbon that's stored there. But what often isn't as frequently recognized is the amount of carbon that can be contained in soils. So up here on the above map, we can see that those blue-green colors are in more of the northern latitudes, including in Canada. So it's important to recognize that although we may not have that tropical vegetation that we often attribute to a lot of carbon taken up, we have a lot in our soils. And a lot of that in the soils are found in our wetlands. So how do wetlands take up and store carbon? So wetlands, as I mentioned, have aquatic vegetation that are undergoing photosynthesis. And during these processes, they're taking up carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Now, wetlands have water, and because of that, have low oxygen conditions. So this means that when vegetation eventually senesces or dies off, it's not readily decomposed. So if you think about, for example, compost, and you throw a piece of a fruit or something away, it's starting to degrade and break down. But because of the water in wetlands, these decomposition rates are really low. So over long periods of time, we get a buildup of carbon in the soils derived from vegetation matter. And wetlands can be hundreds to thousands of years in age. In our research group in Ontario, we find that wetlands can be even up to 5,000, 7,000 years in age. So if imagining these processes and the amount of plant material that's getting built up, that's a lot of carbon that's being stored in the soils. And we find that there can be several meters of soils that have quite a bit of carbon that are stored in the ground. Now, before I move on, of course, a little bit of that makes wetlands a little more complicated, let's say, is that they do release methane. So simultaneously to taking up carbon, they are releasing this potent greenhouse gas. But when looking at wetlands over long periods of time, over tens, hundreds, thousands of years, we do find that the amount of carbon they are taking up outweighs the methane that's being released to the atmosphere. And thus, over these long time periods, they have a net cooling effect. So today there will be talk about Ontario, and of course in Ontario, as I already showed, unfortunately there has been significant alteration of wetlands. So what happens to the carbon when these sites get altered? Well, for one thing, the CO2 processes, the photosynthetic processes that take up carbon dioxide from the atmosphere do come to a halt. Now, methane, of course, is not released anymore because when drained, the water is not, there's no water cover, which is ultimately driving the process of methane emissions. But if we think about all that carbon that's been stored in the soils over long periods of time, when that gets exposed to oxygen, then that begins to break down and gets released to the atmosphere. And that's the issue with wetland and that is one of the issues with wetland alteration in terms of disturbing the carbon pool. So with that, now this is more of an emerging, this has been an emerging research topic in the potential for wetland alteration and destruction to amplify current increases in greenhouse gas emissions. So this leads to interest in wetland conservation and restoration as what we call natural climate solutions. So, implementing conservation within our biosphere of important ecosystems as a means to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Before I finish off or come to the end of my presentation, I do want to put in a plug for restoration, as we have conservation, so protecting a given ecosystem, and restoration, meaning trying to reestablish wetland functions where they had been lost or altered. Now in restoration, the benefit is we can re-wet soils and bring back natural wetland function to enable carbon sequestration to recommence. So for vegetation to grow, carbon dioxide to be taken up from the atmosphere, and for that carbon to be buried and not exposed to oxygen. Now, the one sort of conundrum which we have been studying quite a bit in the science community is, the potential for restored wetlands to be net carbon sinks. Because when they are first restored, of course, they are releasing some methane from the atmosphere. So the question becomes, well, to what extent does the CO2 that they're bringing in outweigh the methane when they are newly created? And what we do find is restored wetlands, of course, in many scenarios are net carbon sinks, although sometimes it can take some time for them to become a net carbon sink and not releasing more methane than the CO2 they're taken up. I can talk about this in more detail, perhaps if we have a discussion or if anybody has any further questions on this, but what I want to take away from this is the importance in prioritizing conservation. So if we're thinking of wetlands that are hundreds to thousands of years in age and have been burying carbon for a really long time, it's really hard to replicate that in restoration. Now, of course, restoration provides an important means and is going to play a role in addressing the climate crisis. But when, I know there's been situations where, you might have a developer that's like, okay, well, we can develop this wetland, but we'll be able to restore it elsewhere. It is tough to recreate a wetland. And so thus comes the importance in thinking about what we call the hierarchy of, conserving at all costs and then resorting to restoration where and when needed. I just wanted on my last slide to show, how this topic has really been emerging. I began my PhD in 2017, and it's been incredible seeing the amount of literature coming out on the role of carbon stocks in ecosystems and their role in providing climate moderation, and on a global scale, but also in Canada specifically, which is really exciting. And we see the overlap of priorities with these kind of measures. So I will leave it at that. And looking forward to questions and hearing the other presenters.
Thanks so much, Amanda. That was fulsome, and I have lots of questions, but I won't put mine out there quite yet. There are a couple of questions that have come in on the chat. And I think really interesting, your focus on conservation. We're going to hear about that from a couple of our local conservation folk, which is great. We have a question, wondering if Amanda can envision any kind of useful role for Phragmites in terms of increased carbon sequestration, given our attitude about the invasive species. Yeah, any thoughts on that?
That is a really good question. So that is something that has been of interest in researching that, because invasive species are so productive and produce so much biomass. Now, just because a lot of biomass is produced, it doesn't necessarily mean it will all get well preserved in the soils, but that's something that's not well known about Phragmites. So actually in my research group, we've been looking at another invasive at one of our wetland sites to see if the presence of the invasive is increasing carbon burial at the site. So I'd say it's not well known, it needs to be better studied, but there certainly is thought that the high biomass production could result in high rates of carbon accumulation.
One more question from Sandra. Will planting trees or recreating wetlands take up more carbon over the same size area? So it's a little bit of a look of which is more effective to sequester.
Ooh, that is a good question. I honestly cannot answer that off the top of my head, but I will say it would depend on a number of factors. Now, I believe with planting trees, initially they do take up quite a bit of carbon dioxide. And I suppose they don't release the same amount of methane as wetlands. So perhaps in early restoration, they could be taking up more carbon. But of course, with all the carbon that's been stored in wetland soils, if that can be restored and carbon can be protected that's already in the soil to prevent it from being further released to the atmosphere, those are two things that are difficult to compare. And it's tough saying over the same size area, especially, it can depend on the region. There's a lot of spatial variability too. So I can't say, and so I suppose I can't say, a one-shot answer for over the same size area, but I'd say both are really important.
Yeah, and the other piece is, so the releasing in terms of restoration is where there's a little bit of a net loss around that in the imbalance is what you're saying.
Yeah, it's in terms of balance. It's, I guess, with wetlands, in my lab we call it, it's a little more handle to care, where you are dealing with the methane component. But again, over time, the amount they take up through photosynthesis should outweigh the amount of methane they are releasing.
Great, beautiful. Thanks, Amanda, and thanks for the questions. Keep the questions coming, folks. And over to Leigh to introduce Anne.
Our next presenter, we're lucky enough to have Anne Bell from Ontario Nature in the room, and she's the Director of Conservation and Education. So she will be addressing a bit more about carbon storage and maybe the flooding, the flood prevention. But she has over 30 years of experience in conservation as a researcher, writer, editor, campaigner, and she's played a lead role in numerous conservation initiatives. So Anne is here. She's and she has a PhD from environmental sciences from York University. She's a mother of two. She's a keen birder and a naturalist who likes traveling and cross-country skiing and shinny, gardening, cooking, and playing cards with her family and friends. So Anne, this is great to have you, and maybe you can let us know how wetlands are assisting with climate change impacts.
So thanks very much, everyone, for the opportunity to participate in this discussion about wetlands and climate change. I really enjoyed Amanda's presentation. All I can say is, if you have any science questions, direct them to her, not to me, because she knows way more than I do about that sort of thing. Anyway, I'm joining you today from Toronto in Treaty 13 territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit. I work for Ontario Nature, and for those who aren't familiar with that organization, it's a charitable provincial conservation organization dedicated to protecting wild species and wild spaces across Ontario through conservation, education, and public engagement. Established in 1931, so we're over 90 years old now. Established in 1931, we represent over 30,000 individual members and supporters and over 155 member groups across the province. So that's a map of our member groups across Ontario. There are several in Grey and Bruce counties, for example, the Owen Sound Field Naturalists, Saugeen Nature, Friends of Sawmill Beach, Friends of McGregor Point, and the Bruce Peninsula Bird Observatory. I'd like to begin by noting that we are blessed with an abundance of wetlands in this country and in this province. About a quarter of the world's wetlands are in Canada, and of those, about a quarter are in Ontario. And these wetlands provide us with many benefits, as Amanda has already explained. You know, they're critical at any time, but they're especially critical now that we're faced with the interrelated crises of climate change and accelerating biodiversity loss. As we communicate with the public and with decision makers, we would do well to point out that these benefits are worth billions of dollars to Ontarians every year. There was one economic study commissioned by the Ministry of Natural Resources a few years back that conservatively estimated those benefits provided by wetlands to be worth at least $51 billion per year in Southern Ontario alone. And there was another study that just came out of the University of Waterloo, looking specifically at the water purification services that benefits provide, and those were worth $4.2 billion per year, again in Southern Ontario alone. For good reason, wetlands are increasingly recognized as nature-based solutions to climate change. And again, this was mentioned by Amanda. And this is because of their exceptional ability to store and sequester carbon, and also to help mitigate the adverse impacts of climate change, such as flooding and drought. And of course, they provide habitat for many species. So if retained on the landscape, they enable plants and animals to move, adapt, and find refuge from climate impacts. There's no doubt when it comes to carbon storage that wetlands punch above their weight. The amount of carbon stored in wetlands is disproportionate to the amount of land that they take up. Though they cover about 5 to 8% of the land's surface, they account for 20 to 30% of the global soil carbon storage. And I'm just hoping I have my facts straight because I know Amanda's listening to this. Wetlands are one of the most cost-effective and efficient ecosystems when it comes to carbon storage. They have higher soil carbon density than forests or grasslands. In the boreal forest, for example, wetlands are believed to account for about 50% of carbon storage. How does this work? Amanda's already explained it, so I don't really think I need to go too deeply into the slide, but in a nutshell, the accumulation of carbon is occurring more quickly than decomposition. If left undisturbed, wetlands can store this carbon for hundreds, and I've just learned tonight, for hundreds and even thousands and thousands of years. Most of the carbon is stored in the deeper soil levels. For example, peatlands are a type of wetland, mostly made up of sphagnum mosses, sedges and shrubs. They're an incredible carbon storehouse which requires protection. We have a huge opportunity in Canada to reduce our emissions by avoiding disturbance of our peatlands. Research indicates that natural undisturbed wetlands are best at storing carbon. So again, this builds on the points that Amanda was making earlier. They're much better than those that we attempt to restore, modify, or construct at storing carbon. So if we want wetlands to serve as nature-based climate solutions, the first and most important rule is to leave them undisturbed. I was so happy to hear that same message from Amanda. It's because it's the key message that we need to take home. We've already lost over 72% of our wetlands in Southern Ontario, and that loss continues. It needs to stop, especially from a climate perspective. And that means we need to be very, very wary of wetland offsetting schemes, which allow destruction to occur based on the premise that there will be compensation through wetland creation or restoration. The notion that humans can recreate a wetland of value equal to the one that has taken hundreds, if not thousands of years to form smacks of human arrogance. But that is an increasingly common view espoused by decision makers, and one which seldom, if ever, factors carbon storage into the equation. So sure, when wetland loss is unavoidable or where it has already occurred, let's offset the loss by restoring and creating new wetlands. But let's never use wetland offsetting as an excuse to allow wetland destruction to occur. The ability of wetlands to mitigate the severity of adverse climate change impacts, such as flooding, was highlighted in the report of Ontario's Special Advisor on Flooding in 2019. The report cited two studies, one by the Insurance Bureau of Canada and one commissioned by the provincial government. They showed that retaining wetlands was a cost-effective way to reduce flood damages and associated costs by up to 29% in rural areas and up to 38% in urban areas. So that does make you wonder why communities have to fight so darn hard to protect local wetlands from development proposals. Wetlands have been described as nature's shock absorbers. That's because during storms and floods, they act like big sponges, absorbing water and slowing down its movement. And then later during dry periods, they can help to balance out the impacts of drought because they've stored the water. Climate change is, of course, an increasing threat to biodiversity. The number one threat is still habitat loss and degradation, but combine climate change with habitat loss, and it's easy to see why wetlands are needed. Plants and animals need refuges. They need movement corridors if they're to adapt and persist in the face of climate change. And wetlands provide habitat for many species, including over 20% of our species at risk. If we want wetlands recognized and embraced as nature-based climate solutions, we need to support policies and programs to protect them. The provincial government has said it will expand protected areas and it will expand the greenbelt. So let's ensure that wetlands are prioritized in both of these initiatives. Keep a watch and speak up if you have an opportunity. The Wetland Conservation Strategy for Ontario was produced after extensive public consultation and published in 2017, yet it's been sitting on the shelf ever since. So another thing we can ask our government to do is to take that strategy off the shelf and get it implemented. At the local level too, in municipal and conservation authority policies and programs, we need to ensure that wetlands get the attention and the investment that they deserve as nature-based climate solutions. So there's lots that can be done at the local level. For organizations that are interested in carbon assessments of conservation lands, I wanted to let you know about Ontario Nature's upcoming workshop series. Our first workshop will be happening on March 1st in the evening, and it will be an opportunity to connect with other grassroots organizations interested in carbon assessments and to learn about Ontario Nature's current work. We're in the process of we're in the process of developing a user-friendly, credible guide and recommendations on approaches to carbon assessments, because it's not easy and it requires some expertise, but there are tools out there, and so we want to make those tools more readily available to people. So once we've developed the guide and the recommendations, we plan to distribute those widely. So if you'd like to represent your organization at that meeting, please contact, I've put down the contact information there for Jenna Cardoso at Ontario Nature, because she's lining them up. And if not Jenny, you can always contact me, and I can connect you with Jenna. But it should be a very interesting workshop and a chance to exchange some ideas and find out what sort of carbon assessment approaches are out there. And that's it for me. So thanks very much for your attention, and I look forward to the conversation this evening.
Thanks so much, and a really wonderful sort of overview of a number of other of the services, I heard the word used, that wetlands provide to us. There's a couple of questions or comments still holding on to the concerns around Phragmites. Somebody that's feeling very concerned and discouraged with the spread. And then a question from Anne about what if Phragmites, and this could be for you or for Amanda, if anybody knows, or any others in the group, what if Phragmites get into undisturbed wetland?
Well, I'll just say to the last question, it's a disaster when Phragmites enters into undisturbed wetlands. It's a disaster from a biological perspective.
I was just going to say the same thing. It's horrible. Biologically, it takes over, and it's also really hard to remove. It's really hard to get rid of. There are efforts in Southern Ontario. There's a group down by Long Point on conservation. There's a number of stakeholders that are working together, because the Phragmites is quite an issue down there, and trying to find the best approaches to getting rid of it. But it's really hard. So preventing it from getting in is really important.
Yeah. There's another couple of questions, and I'm not sure who might want to answer them, related to peat extraction. And a question around how much wetlands are lost through peat extraction for gardening and farming. And I know I lived for a while in an area where peat extraction was rampant, and people were charged, and they just kept on going and going and going. So the first piece is how much are we destroying, how much are lost, and then should we be thinking about actually not purchasing peat moss because it has to come from wetlands, and we need to find something else to put into our gardens?
I'll try to answer just generally the question. Don't buy peat moss. Okay. I grew up, my father and mother were gardeners, and we always had bags of peat moss. And now that I know what I know about wetlands and their destruction, and the fact that we destroyed so much in Southern Ontario, I'm horrified. Yeah. Don't be buying peat moss, for sure.
So is peat moss only sourced from wetlands? Is that kind of like, that's the number one source?
Amanda for that one, but
yeah, that's a good question. I mean, unless it's, I don't know, like greenhouse grown or something, it's probably from wetlands, and maybe it's within forest. But often, if it's within forest, it can be like a swampy, peaty area.
That's great. And thank you, Anne. And yeah, I think our next speaker can also address some of these questions. He is Erik Downing, and he's the Manager of Environmental Planning and Regulations at Saugeen Conservation Authority. So he's managed the department for about 9 years. He's been there 15 years. He's proud to lead a great team as the authority works with landowners. As most of you know, they work with landowners to protect the watersheds. Specifically for SVCA is the Saugeen River Valley, so the Pine and the Penetangor rivers along Lake Huron shoreline, and fringe shoreline watersheds as well between Southampton and Point Clark. That's all in the SVCA, the Saugeen Valley Conservation Authority. So Erik's here, and Erik, what are the risks to our local wetlands?
Yeah, thanks, Leigh, and thanks to the introduction, and to Joachim and Jenny for hosting me, and for the land acknowledgement. Great presentations from Amanda and Anne, of course. And so what are the risks to local wetlands, and how are we protecting them? Again, with the introduction there, you've heard that I'm the Manager of Environmental Planning and Regulations at Saugeen Conservation. So I'll be going through sort of the overview of conservation authorities quickly. Most of you are initiated there, of course. I'll also, some of the presenters that preceded me went over the wetland services far better than I can, but I have some on the ground visuals that maybe help some of the references that was very, very well pulled out and offered already. Talk about some wetland loss in general, and specifically some of the threats in our jurisdiction that we're seeing. And then also talk about how we're protecting them and what laws and controls we have. So of course, there's 36 conservation authorities across Southern Ontario. Most of the population of Ontario, of course, governed by a CA, therefore. Set up in the 40s as watershed agencies, sort of quasi-governmental, bound and orders set by watershed boundaries. Very novel idea then, and even still. Our mandate, of course, is to ensure the conservation of Ontario's water and land and that habitats, and we're governed by a board of local politicians and appointees that are able to shape that CA goal for the local area. This is the Saugeen's jurisdiction, of course, more or less from, if you can follow my cursor, sort of Markdale and Dundalk on the eastern edge, south of Mount Forest, a little bit north of Paisley as you move across and west. And then, of course, along Lake Huron shoreline from Port Elgin to Southampton, I should say, to Point Clark, more or less, and picking up the Pine, the Penetangor, some of the Huron fringe watersheds, and of course, the mighty Saugeen River. So the Saugeen Valley Conservation Authority, and everybody notice the new logo, please. My shirt is not up to date here. Our new logo here is hot off the press over the last couple of months. We got rid of the very familiar and loved Canadian Cobra chicken, otherwise known as a Canada Goose, and moved to the logo you see here. Moving forward with the times, I guess. But anyway, we are involved, of course, with flood control and some of the structures that we maintain and monitor around many of the communities in our jurisdiction. We are involved with land stewardship and water quality improvement initiatives. We have a forestry program, of course. There's my section, of course, the watershed planning and regulation section, not always the most loved section of any CA, and the same is true with the Saugeen. But of course, also environmental monitoring with regards to groundwater, base flow, and an education program, as long as many of our properties and recreation areas that are so well enjoyed. So, of course, we're here to talk about wetlands today, and already a great overview of what they do and don't do for the climate change challenge ahead of us. I wanted to highlight, of course, in our jurisdiction, we do have the Greenock Swamp. I believe it is recognized as the largest wooded swampland in Southern Ontario. I'm not saying a heck of a lot, of course, given the slide, of course, that Amanda put up in that we've lost a lot of them in Southern Ontario, but I think in and around, several, I think it's 10,000 or 11,000 hectares or acres or so continuous. My slide on the left indicates ownership by the Conservation Authority, and of course the wooded areas around it are swamplands as well, and I believe it is continuing over here. We didn't get Smith Lake on this map. And then I think that's the MNR recognition of that same Greenock area, the Greenock Swamp area, but a significant wetland in our jurisdiction, and one that I have some visuals with on what services it actually offers our area in actual visuals. And this, fortunately, is not a COVID-19 chart. This is one to do with the natural world around us. And it is a hydrograph or a flow chart for two different rivers, two different watersheds in our jurisdiction in a flood event. So the Teeswater River is a river that goes right through the Greenock Swamp and is largely fed by the Greenock Swamp, as is indicated in red on this graph below us. So over on the left is how deep the water gets, and on the bottom is how many days it took to do that. So the river flow is indicated by this ongoing line. So you see the Teeswater River react very differently to a flood, rain, and rainfall event. I think it is a rainfall event in this context, than the South Saugeen River. A river, indeed, in our jurisdiction actually has a fair amount of wetlands still in it, but not nearly the same as the Greenock Swamp's influence on the Teeswater. You see a very different hydrograph with regards to the flood that is incurred with the same event, more or less hitting both watersheds the same, which is proof exactly to what Anne was discussing in that flood reduction and flood harm reduction, which is so key and so valuable from wetlands. The curve is longer, is flatter, and that is all good things when it comes to flood mitigation, of course. And what does that mean actually on the ground? Well, in my realm and in my role, I am a regulatory authority. I am a provincial fences officer. I oversee many other provincial fences officers who are tasked with administering the Conservation Authorities Act, controlling what wetlands are, harmed or not, basically in our jurisdiction. And very often we are, folks are, I just want to take an acre. I just want to take a half acre here. It's just, it's just a little wetland. What does it matter on the grand scheme of things? Well, this is Walkerton in a snowmelt event, I believe, the exact same location, the exact same bridge. And you can see that any little impact on that watershed's ability to hold back water, which is what each wetland is doing, can have a significant impact downstream. In fact, catastrophic in the case of this bridge, potentially, if we had lost a little bit more wetland upstream. That's Lobbies, or just in Walkerton there, I believe, right at Lobbies Park, the bridge that crosses the main Saugeen there. So this visual was already brought up earlier, but mine's a little bit more detailed for whatever reason. I'm going to see if I can zoom in for us on our Grey and Bruce County that I'm mostly interested in anyway. So this map is broken down into former geographic townships. And yeah, while Grey's done a little bit better at not losing wetlands, Bruce has along our shoreline in Kincardine townships and Huron townships lost a lot, with the red being an indication of about 80 to 100% wetland loss. So again, that was sort of, I think the timestamp on that was sort of European colonial contact, and to now the loss experienced. But now we're trying to do a little bit better, and that's my role exactly in my task. So in my department, we have a couple different approaches to doing this and tackling this tough task of protecting wetlands and floodplains and rivers. We have plan input and review, which is meaning we're reviewing severances, we're reviewing subdivisions, and seeing if they're going in the right spots. If they're hurting wetlands, we comment accordingly and are guided by policies set by the province or our own authority to protect. We also have involvement with other pieces of legislation, like the Drainage Act. You know, if there is a municipal drain going through a wetland, that can have a huge impact. We're involved there. If there's a road going through a wetland and it's out of our regulatory jurisdiction because it's with, you know, MTO or a provincial entity that we cannot regulate, we can still provide details that, hey, you know, you're redoing that bridge on 89 MTO. We have information on the floodplain there that bridge needs to be higher. But the main focus of the rest of my conversation here is the regulation, which is our permitting and actual control with regards to wetlands specifically and other natural features. So the development interference with wetlands, alteration to shorelines and watercourses regulation, Ontario Regulation 16906, is the SVCA's regulation. And its goal is more or less to protect natural hazards from people and people from natural hazards therein in doing so. And in that task, in that goal, we end up sort of protecting local ecosystems because it is part and parcel. It is that natural infrastructure that it all relies on. So wetlands are defined very specifically in the CA Act as being all of these things that you see in front of you. They have to be covered by water at a point of the year, not all the year. They have to contribute to the hydrologic function of the watershed through connection with a surface watercourse. Groundwater works as well. They have to have hydric soils, pretty deep also, I would add, and they have to have vegetation dominated by hydrophilic or water-loving plants or water-tolerant plants. It has to have all of those things. If it's missing any of those things, I can't control it, I can't protect it. And it does not include agricultural land sometimes covered by water. We also regulate areas next to or near wetlands, and that is 400 feet or 120 meters off of PSWs, and within 100 feet or 30 meters of other wetlands, whereby, of course, if you have a wetland, you pave right up to it or you fill right up to it, and you don't let that water drain into it anymore, it's not going to work anymore. So that's why we're involved in that near area of wetlands as well. We have mapping online that, of course, indicates where we have interest. We've updated this one from what you see here. If you go to our website, you get a better version of this, but you can see many of the areas we regulate, if you can follow my cursor there, are heavily wooded areas, wetlandy areas with big offsets from the edge of them, that anywhere within these yellow areas, if you want to do work, if you want to drain, if you want to grade, if you want to tile drain, you have to come and talk to us and potentially get a permit from us to do that work. And the idea of our permitting is, of course, to protect these things and allow, though, that development to proceed, hopefully, as well. So here's some examples of some projects I've permitted over, well, recently, actually. Heavy construction equipment needed to get through a wetland here to do work over here, not in a wetland. They had a lane that wasn't big enough and they wanted to expand the laneway excessively, and it would have hurt the wetland. So I work with that landowner to come up with sort of construction matting that would go over the area. And once the work is done, that matting will come up, the area will be restored because it will have some impact still, but much, much better than, of course, a new laneway or a huge laneway or an airstrip going through there. Similarly, on the right, this was a roadway that was already in place, needed to be redone. We wanted to ensure that the wetland was able on either side of this road to continue to pass through and be able to still have some hydraulic connectivity to itself and not get sort of island out. Of course, when we have people that do want to do it right, there's people that don't want to do it right as well. And some threats in our jurisdiction are certainly development. That's always a pressure. People still aren't aware of the value and what these wetlands offer in many instances. They still see it, as we've heard earlier, as wasted land. So they don't know about us and they go and do the work first, and we have to catch up with them after the fact. That's been a constant in our jurisdiction, and we'll keep working with landowners to avoid that. On the right, we see another phenomenon happening in our watershed lately. GTA's ran out of room to put their dirt, so they've been shipping it out. And we have on the right a large fill operation whereby thousands of trucks are heading outwards from the GTA trying to find places to put this fill, and they just find the first hole and they put it there. They pay the landowner, sometimes handsomely, to put it there, and don't want anybody to don't always ask, you know, what and where and who should be permitting that. So it's a big challenge we have here. This is an area that thousands of truckloads of fill came and actually filled into the wetland here. I've been able to get them to pull back and try to restore a little bit, and that work's ongoing. But of course, with our regulation, there is the enforcement component, and you know that's maybe being updated shortly. But currently, the fine is $10,000 up to if you're convicted. Potentially a term of imprisonment up to 3 months. That rarely doesn't happen. You have to do something pretty bad for that. But the real kicker is a restoration of the site. That's always the kicker of our regulation, where we want to see the site restored, and that can come with significant cost, of course. We have had some success in our enforcement role lately. Just some of the more recent instances with wetlands is in 2014, we had a property owner that removed 7 acres of a provincially significant wetland. They did end up pleading guilty to a JP, just as the piece that they had done the work, did not get approval for it. And they did restore that wetland to the Conservation Authority's satisfaction, 7 acres worth at their cost. Another one in 2017, similarly, they filled the wetland, and in order to have us withdraw the charge and not end up at a trial, they did restore that wetland, fortunately. And their arguments around Crown Patents and British North America Act, which we have heard, uses arguments sometimes in our jurisdiction as reasons why you don't have to listen to provincial law, did not hold water, pardon the pun.
There's a number of questions around, are we at risk up here the way that the area that was the wetland that was destroyed or is threatened around the 413, Highway 413 minister's zoning order that just simply came down without consultation, and kaboom, all of a sudden there was an opportunity to go in and act in a way that was not aligned with the regulations. So is there a danger that those kinds of non-consultation based, not engaging with conservation authorities, could those things happen up here? Are we in danger of our wetlands being, you know, taken down for transportation development and agriculture, I guess, as well?
Yeah, thanks, Jenny. We haven't seen a lot of MZOs up here, but we are seeing some. I think the one that I've seen so far, it doesn't look necessarily to be a trouble from a wetland or floodplain perspective, just so happenstance. But we are certainly open to that type of sort of, you know, omnibus sort of legislation coming down on us and superseding any controls or protections that I have. And it does what it does then, right? That's sort of the idea of that thing, is it sort of jumps the local politicians, it jumps the local controls for some goal that yeah, I don't sympathize with too much, but and probably this group as well. But yeah, the Conservation Authority in such an instance is, I believe, compelled or required to issue the permit if there is an MZO that wants to go to a wetland, for instance. We can issue conditions of approval to our satisfaction, either to staff or to the authorities, being our boards, you know, comfort level with that, which those conditions can be appealed. That is built into our act and our regulation. So we are certainly not seeing a ton, not as much interest up here, of course, not quite as much hard and fast development in our area, though it is busy along those lines. But it will not, if it does come to us, we will have all the same trouble that we've seen the southern jurisdictions have.
Okay, and just from a regulatory perspective, the Saugeen Conservation and is the enactor of the provincial regulations. So if we have deep concerns about how a piece of land is being, or wetland is being threatened, it would be through a conservation authority and then to the ministry, or kind of going at both at the same time? Because of course we want to think about how we can, you know, use our agency if we're concerned about the life of our wetlands. So what would we do?
I think
who's the boss of this, I guess, is the thing, right?
Yeah, certainly there are Conservation Authority Act changes underway. I would plead with this group to keep your ear open to the Environmental Registry and any opportunity for comment at a sign of CA Act being, changed is something certainly worth a review. With regards to specific developments, though, that may be concerning you in your area or in the watershed, staff reviewing that file can certainly be contacted directly, and we can inform you of the appropriate steps that you can take there to get your concerns heard to our board of directors potentially, to your local planning decision-making body, because ultimately, yeah, if my bosses are only hearing from the developer that this has to go, it's only good for all these reasons, they do, and as we all would if you only hear one side of the story, would and could believe that. If there is the other side of the coin, though, there is neighbors and there is environmental groups in the area and they are concerned, if those concerns are brought forward to my bosses, to the board of directors at your local CA or your local planning decision body, that can only help the situation and balance out that equation, whereby if they only hear one side of the story, it's only pro-development, they can believe that. If they hear, though, that the community has a different thing to say about it, I've seen them also understand and hear that and make that a big part of their decision-making process, which is only great. Along those lines, we're about to review our own policies manual in my department. We have a policies manual that guide whatever we permit and don't permit. And something that was brought up earlier by Anne around compensation when a wetland is going to be, infringed upon, is compensation something that I could reach for if I'm permitting something. Oh, well, you're going to rip a wetland, you're going to lose 3 acres, make 6 acres over here. Currently, my policy manual would not allow that. It would be nope, you're going to wreck a wetland, you don't move past that. That's my staff direction from the board. That's the policy that guides me. If that is changed, if that policy is amended coming up, which would get public consultation if you pay attention to our website, then that changes, of course. I can do compensation. I can permit something if they're going to redo it somewhere else, maybe against my own personal feelings about it, along the lines of the previous presenters. But if groups and individuals that care about such things, such as this group, keeps their ear to the ground and makes their comments and concerns known about that potential policy, if it were to make the new draft, I would be all for it.
Right, and it sounds as though the science shows, from what Amanda was saying, that the conservation over restoration or moving or any of that, what you're talking about, compensation, that there's a huge argument for conservation from a scientific perspective, therefore from a climate change impact. Okay, so a couple of other things about health relating to Roundup, and also a question from Anne about industrial crop production in proximity to wetlands and the health of the ecosystem. So there's the use of Roundup close by and also industrial crop production close by.
I can say that the approach that we've established at my CA, agricultural practices, use of land, tilling at a certain time of year, that's not anything I can go and do anything about. What RCA has implemented over the last number of years and has a continued interest in is the tile drainage, systematic tile drainage that you see going in very often in rural areas and farm areas that inevitably are always trying to outlet to the low spot, which is very often the wetland. We have regulated those systematic tile drain installations in our jurisdiction. There wasn't a lot of resources for us to look to set those policies. But we are very interested to make sure that tile draining is not draining a wetland. We're allowing, we only have control near the wetland, as you saw, in those drains at all. So when they come into wetlands, if they want to drain through the wetland, if they're going to put all the systematic tiles from the field towards the wetland, if they get, though, within the groundwater or near the groundwater or in the wetland, we don't allow them to have perforated tiles anymore, trying to avoid that drainage of the wetland. But many CAs are not doing the same. They're not sure how they can or should regulate that activity. We're just seeing so much work on it, and we see a real risk from that work potentially impacting wetlands, that we've tried this policy and been fairly successful with it so far. Not seeing the flood impacts downstream, allowing the systematic tile drainage to proceed with permitting as opposed to no permitting at all. So we've had measured success so far. A lot of concern from landowners when they see it going into us, and we have our boundaries and our our edges of control that we've been, you know, for the last probably 10 years doing, and doing with a fair amount of success in our jurisdiction anyway.
Okay, and just because it's on the same theme, and then we'll go on to Bob. Sorry for keeping you waiting here, Bob. Are you seeing an increase with the smaller wetlands being lost to the tile drainage and agriculture? You're seeing it, but are you seeing that as a growing concern?
In our jurisdiction, we do not have policies that support the removal of wetlands with tile draining, certainly. In our policy, we'll allow tile drainage near wetlands when it gets too close to the wetland that there may be a hydraulic impact. We do not allow perforated drains. If the drain is to go into a wetland or go through a wetland, again, we would do non-perforated tiles, hopeful that the water that's in the wetland would stay in the water, and just the extra drainage or the rush of drainage off the field would be able to pass by. We certainly know that that isn't airtight from a scientific perspective, but in the absence of anything, we've implemented that, and we think it's been doing better than nothing anyway.
Right.
But it is a sensitive item. You know, there's a lot of those proposals coming in, and it's a balance certainly to be struck.
Okay, that's great. And we will pick up on the other conversations and questions, but I'll turn back to Leigh to introduce Bob.
Yes, and it is Jenny will absolutely. I know Anne wanted to get in there. Everybody unmuted, so we'll go back, and it's Jenny and my job to make sure that those loose ends don't get left. But we want to get Bob's intro in. He's Bob Barnett, and he is with the Escarpment Biosphere Conservancy. He's going to talk about a little bit about the dollar value of wetlands to us, and he knows a heck of a lot about this area. Because EBC is very active in this area in our region. He helped found the organization 25 years ago after 10 years helping the Bruce Trail as a volunteer. Bob, of course, enjoys the benefits of nature by getting out to hit the land reserves and talking to people interested about conserving their land. And Bob, I'll run your slideshow, and maybe you can address how much wetland is actually up here.
Great. So thanks for the introduction. So we're Escarpment Conservancy, and put this slide up. These are all pictures of our reserves. Everybody thinks of us as cliffs, but we also protect lakes like Barney Lake in the picture and Huron shoreline. So those blue spots represent our nature reserves, and the south end you've got Lake Ontario. It kind of runs up the spine of the escarpment, up past Tobermory and right across Manitoulin, up into the Kosh. And we've done work as far over as Goderich, as you can see with the dots there. So just a quick snapshot of Escarpment Biosphere Conservancy. We got started in '97. And we go from Niagara Escarpment over to Lake Huron. So it's not just what they call the slopey bits, but we're interested in the whole escarpment, the forest beside and the rivers that run through it. So we have 201 nature reserves, 142 of those are owned. The others are conservation agreements where the landowner owns the land, but we have development restrictions in place. We've got almost 19,000 acres protected, so that's 75 square kilometers. A little easier to visualize 75 square kilometers. We have 70 species of conservation concern protected on our various reserves. Over the 25 years, we've managed to sequester 733,000 tons of CO2, and we're every year protecting $34 million worth of ecological services. So I'll talk about that a little later. And I guess we're the largest of the Ontario active trusts. Nature Conservancy is bigger than us. And more or less once a month, we're making a new reserve. And we are now helping other land trusts sequester carbon. So we've sold our carbon offsets so far for about $500,000, and we continue to sell it. So of our 19,000 acres, 2,165 acres of that are wetland, 171 acres are open water, We've got 19 kilometers of Lake Huron shoreline protected, and a lot of that is important coastal wetlands, etc. We do have 7 properties along the Saugeen River. That's one of our highlight areas. I've got 3 more in progress on the Saugeen, but we also work on the Mad River, Sauble, Sydenham, and the Potawatomi. So we're working all over the place on the rivers. Next one, the pictures you see on the side, that was Long Swamp. And then, so the values of wetland. So we used the same reference that I think Ann cited earlier, estimating ecosystem services in Southern Ontario. It's an Ontario government study. And that would tell us that our wetlands are worth about $13.3 million annually. That are the services that they're providing to the community. So interestingly enough, that 11% of our land area, wetlands, accounts for 39% of our overall ecosystem production. So just for fun, wetlands, they say in this study, are worth, this study incidentally didn't just arrive out of nowhere. They amalgamated 100 previous studies and put it all together to get these composite figures. They're saying that wetlands are worth $15,000 per hectare per year. So that a wetland is worth a lot of money to all of us. So where does that come from? Recreation, $3,500, aesthetic, $6,400, cultural, $2,200, water quality, $2,700. So these wetlands are providing our communities with a lot of value. Picture of Boyd Lake there. That's one of our reserves. So why are we protecting lands, especially wetlands? Well, of course, biodiversity, aesthetics is important, health. People get out into nature. It's actually good for your health. It keeps you out of the hospital. We're saving the government a lot of money. So of course there's economic value like tourism, connectivity, and we are very interested in climate change adaptation. I just spoke at the Grey County Climate Action Group the other day and made a rather impassioned plea that they include in their climate action strategy something that's not there right now. Keeping mature trees. Our mature trees are doing so much good for us, but that's not part of their strategy to keep those trees on the ground instead of sending them to the mill. And only 15% of harvested wood lasts for 100 years. There's kind of a myth that it all goes into furniture and houses. Well, only 15% stays around for a while. Most of it turns out to be toilet paper and newspapers and things that are flushed down the toilet. One of the ways that we work with landowners is where the landowner wants to retain their land, but they want to make sure that good things continue to happen on that land. So they work with us to create a conservation agreement where they dictate the wording. They tell us what things they don't want on their property. So this would include things like no drainage, no water extraction for sale, the land won't be severed, not going to put buildings in the wetland, there won't be mining. That's pretty serious effect when the land is mined. And you can actually write how you won't allow bad forestry, or you can describe what good forestry is. So these restrictions are put on by landowners who, a lot of them are my age, and these restrictions last into perpetuity. So that's good news. And that's a little picture of Hamilton Creek, where we have a conservation agreement with the original landowner, Gunter Springer. And that land has now been sold, so the restrictions go on with the next landowners. So to quickly talk here about externalities, this is all these natural services are externalities. So there's a definition there, but these are things that economists don't count when they're figuring out whether a company's making a profit or whether the province is being successful. So overlooking these externalities or ecosystem services overlooks such a huge fraction of the real economic value. So we have to persuade our governments to get these into the calculations when we're doing economic impact studies, when we're putting forward a road. I was one of the original consultants on the 413, this new highway through the Greenbelt. And I tried like heck to get them to tell us what the ecosystem damage was going to be if they put this road through. And they wouldn't tell us, they wouldn't agree to study it. It was a great frustration. So I don't know whether you picture a natural area or a nature reserve as a factory, but in a funny way, these conserved lands are huge factories. So at one end, they're absorbing all these bad things like carbon and particulate in the air and floodwater and pollution, and they're dealing with that. And out the other end, mysteriously happens, there are great things coming out the other end. We've got recreation, we've got health, we've got pollinators, we've got rare species, and good vibes. So the nature is doing good stuff for us. So I'm not going to tell you that my image of the value of nature is shared by all municipalities, because a lot of municipalities absorb tax losses because frequently we're exempt from paying property taxes. Municipalities may only get some of the benefits that nature is providing. Some benefits are going to all Canadians, and some benefits are going to tourism and local entrepreneurs. So it's not always the municipality that benefits, but it is the municipality that loses the taxes. The province tries to balance it with the municipal partnership fund, but all municipalities don't agree with that. At any rate, nature is doing a good job, and we have to we have to work with that and get as much nature conserved as possible. So this is a picture up on concession 17 south of Wyerton of the Miller property. And there's a picture from Francis Lake. So that's my presentation, and happy to answer any. And if you want to contact us, it's escarpment.ca. I love talking to landowners about protecting their land, so don't hesitate to talk to us.
So give Bob a call or connect with him if you've got lands that you want to see in perpetuity protected. That's what you're in conserved. That's
the very idea, right?
Beautiful thing. Beautiful thing. I'm going to do a couple of catch-ups here, and I don't know whether Leigh and Joachim want to weigh in. There's been quite a beaver conversation going on around concern about the beavers having owned being the kings of the land, and that they were doing a lot of wetland protection, and the disappointment around hearing that the authority is not concerned or isn't issuing anything around destruction of beavers. But Erik's responded to that to some extent around some of the MNR. If you want to look at that, I think, yeah, sorry, the MNR here. So there's a conversation about beavers going on. It's definitely, and the destruction of the dams or not, and whether they do good for wetlands. There's definitely a theme around the minister's zoning orders, and people could watch a video around that Leigh has put in the chat to understand that and how important it is for us to be aware of anything that's going on in relation to those kinds of things coming down on us. I'm going to backtrack way back. I don't think Anne and someone else, I don't think we got a response around the impact of Roundup and also the industrial crop production close to wetlands. Has anybody got anything they want to comment around specifically with that?
I can't comment on the glyphosate. I don't have anything to comment in terms of the glyphosate question, but in terms of intensive agriculture around a wetland, and Erik touched on this a little bit, that and a wetland can be doesn't necessarily have to just be altered. It doesn't need, if it's altered, it's not necessarily directly. It could happen indirectly too. So if there's activity going on that's affecting water inflow, maybe it's impeding it or increasing it, then that has an impact on the wetland ecosystem. So there are disturbances that can occur and affect the health of the wetland without it being directly altered.
And Erik, the piece that you had up with the Grigg swamp, there is agriculture around there. Are there margins of some kind that are required from wetlands?
The permitting requirements that I have require development or site alteration to be occurring for us to even be able to have jurisdiction over it. So most of the areas surrounding the Grigg swamp, yes, it's agriculture surrounding it, and there is not beyond, MECP controls around pollution, sort of the other laws that farmers are having to follow. There's nothing that the CA has with regards to existing agriculture next to a wetland, and you can't do this or that. We don't have any controls over that. There's other legislation around what you use and when and how on your land for farmers that they have to balance and keep straight. They have many legislation pieces to follow, I know, but not anything with the CA. If they want to expand their agricultural field into the wetland, that's when certainly my regulation comes in. And yeah, they would have to prove no negative impact on the wetland. Obviously a difficult thing to do if you're removing some of it. But that's how the permitting realm works. Or if they're expanding into an area, grading or filling near enough the wetland that it could impact the hydrology of the wetland, we can and do have jurisdiction on that.
Okay, thank you. There's a few continuing conversations about which type of wetland sequesters the most carbon. A conversation between Bob and Peter that actually the cattail wetlands are particularly good sequesters. I don't know whether anybody wants to comment on which type of wetlands do the best job in service.
I can comment on that. I would say traditionally, peatlands have been regarded as sequestering the most carbon and do have the most carbon dense soils, and coastal marshes, for example, like salt marshes, they don't release as much methane, or actually release quite minimal methane in comparison to their freshwater counterparts. So they're often regarded as really good net carbon sinks. But more recently, there's increasing research coming out on the importance of swamps and freshwater marshes, because they haven't been as traditionally regarded as being, significant carbon sinks, and they often have more mineral soils than, say, kind of the peaty soils that you find in bogs and fens. But we do find that they do have high rates of carbon accumulation, even if they are also accumulating mineral soils. And my final point I'll make to that is that, it's also important to consider the aerial extent. So for example, freshwater marshes are quite prevalent. So, when you add it all up, even if their soils aren't as carbon dense as bogs and fens, they still can add up. It can still add up to be quite a significant carbon stock.
Okay, thanks for that. Back to the peat bog while you're bringing it up. Thanks, Michelle and Lorraine, on we don't need to use peat. We can use other mulches, things from our compost and leaves and twigs and all that kind of thing. So that's a little aside. Jeanette asks, are you starting to take another look at your floodplain planning with a view to expanding them in view of climate change? Whose job is that, the floodplain planning?
Yeah, thanks, Jenny. Not my role at the CA, but I do dabble, and I'm aware of a flood warning component of our work, and mapping. Certainly, mapping is what's guiding where I regulate or don't. So currently, the Conservation Authority at Saugeen Conservation and pretty much everywhere south of us until you get eastwards over to around, I think, the Lower Trent. South of us and over to Lower Trent, everybody in that jurisdiction uses Hurricane Hazel as our regional storm event, the worst that can be expected and was proven to be able to come here historically in a reasonable amount of time, has been chosen as our upper limit of flood. That's the flood that we then protect to and regulate a little bit from. And that is a set rain event that is, this hour, this much flow, this hour, this much rain comes down, this hour, this much rain comes down. And that therefore is not influenced by yeah, the potential for climate change. The only good thing about it is that it is a really huge storm. It's a pretty bad one. So it is not moving though with climate change data as it's coming in. The other side of our work is that we pick the worst of either Hurricane Hazel or the 100-year flood. So the 100-year flood is a 1% risk of it happening any given year, and it is set based on hindcasting of the rainfall that we've experienced, you know, in our data set, you know, as far back as we can measure, basically. As climate change brings new storms to our door, that new data does influence what that 100-year looks like, and for the most part, it's increasing it. But that 100-year floodplain is still based on hindcasting, not forecasting. So that is a challenge and a problem, certainly, of our regulation currently, that it is looking at either the fixed Hurricane Hazel event or hindcasting from into the past when we weren't into as many climate change impacts for the anticipated flows that we're going to see in our jurisdiction. And it is showing itself as being a problem in our jurisdiction. In the last 15 years, or as long as I've been at this CA, we've seen 4 200-year events. that isn't really supposed to happen. It can happen. It's just a % chance any given year. But fortunately, it was all on smaller watersheds and little nooks and crannies of our jurisdiction, not the whole thing at once. So we didn't have a 200-year flood on the whole of our jurisdiction. And as I said, those events are, you know, influencing the data for the 100-year flood. But yeah, nobody's really come up with how do we anticipate what rain is going to be next year and 50 years from now. And okay, what's the mapping we need to protect ourselves with? We don't have that in hand yet.
Is there a relationship with water levels rising in the Great Lakes and the expansion of nearby wetlands? So all 4 of you need to perk up on this because I'm not sure who was going to want to answer it. 10 years ago, so this is really about new wetlands. 10 years ago, there was a pond on top of an alvar that was only seasonal. And then the last few years, it's growing and coming and larger, and the bulrushes are coming, the herons are coming, the ducks are coming and paddling. This is anecdotal, but what about trends, especially on alvars? Are we seeing some new wetlands that are developing?
I guess I can't comment, you know, on the local aspect of it, but I think Erik mentioned it maybe in the chat a bit earlier, but, you know, with wetter conditions can result in higher water tables, more groundwater, higher lake levels, and that can all contribute to wetter lands, which it results in more aerial wetland. And you know, I mean, it'll be interesting, you know, when looking at climate change projections, because, you know, one of the questions is you know, are we going to get more precipitation in certain regions? And so in regions that are going to be wetter, it could mean, you know, higher water levels in places, and say wetlands that are seasonally flooded, maybe they will be flooded more often than if the conditions were drier.
Thanks, Amanda. Does anybody else want to comment on, are some wetlands increasing? Erik?
Yeah, it's hyper location specific, but inevitably in our jurisdiction and anywhere really, soil erosion and sort of organic material buildup is a reality in you know, low pockets as well. So it could be that feature was, you know, over time, over years, slowly building up some erosion, some sediment from runoff, its own material, you know, animal contributions, of course. You know, the nature of erosion is that the earth is trying to flatten itself. So even when it's a hole, it tries to fill itself. If it's a mountain, it tries to grind it down. So that could be the local, you know, hyper local conditions influencing that. And certainly something we see all the time. Another thing we regulate is we probably make most in this group skin crawl, but cleanouts. We get the inquiries for cleanouts all the time for nice natural water courses or ditches or wetlands that they're messy and they need to be cleaned out. And it is a regulated activity, so we do permit and review them. But it is a real thing too. You know, erosion is filling in the basins that landowners are using to control drainage on their property. and it is a reality across the landscape. But yes, as Amanda had referenced, I had offered that the Great Lakes Basin has got a lot of rain lately. That's partially why the lake levels have went up, as far as I understand. There's many other explanations for it as well, of course, none of which I control, of course. But
It'd be helpful if you did. It'd be so easy.
Yeah, it'd be easy. The easy button.
Yeah.
I'll stop there.
Thanks so much. And moving on, there's a question for Bob. Bob, it sounds like the idea of in perpetuity includes protection from these kind of fast track developments. So these minister zoning orders where things just happen so quickly without time to be consulted. Would you have to work around these, like any kind of NZO for critical infrastructure would have to work around the tracts? Is that right, Bob?
Okay, so our control goes only so far. We have had a little bit of expropriation happen for the road between Grey and Bruce counties. We lost a fraction of an acre there. And when you're dealing with permissions like that, we had a very interesting case where we have a conservation agreement in Mattawa, and the province was going to put a bypass right through our area. So I wrote to the ministry folks involved and said, you can't do that because the federal government won't let you and the provincial government won't let you. So it's not just us that has to approve a change in an agreement, and it's got to be the province and the federal government when we do it as an eco gift and give people a nice tax receipt for it. So the ministry personnel gave it to the consultant, and the consultant just wrote us a rude letter and said, oh, they'll just expropriate their way through. So there is a point at which we cannot resist, you know, we can't stand up against an expropriation, but anything else we can stomp. Landowner cut down 1,400 trees he wasn't supposed to. We didn't have to go to court. His lawyer told him he better smarten up, and he ran towards a settlement with us. So we can control almost everything except an expropriation.
Okay, I bet that would also, expropriation could include ministry zoning order, it sounds like.
Yeah, that would be included in that bag, yes.
And I wonder, Anne, if you could just help us understand the MZO orders that there's an Ontario Nature good link to. Those are provincial. What's the federal role in this? Like, where does the focus need to go? Is it mostly provincial and municipal / conservation authority? You mentioned that Ontario strategy for wetland protection. What's happening with, yeah.
So the minister's zoning orders are very specific to Ontario. It's the Minister of Municipal Affairs and Housing who issues them. And it allows the minister basically to override planning policy. So whereas in normal municipal land use planning policy, they have to have consultation and all the rest of that sort of thing to come to decisions. With an MZO, they can override that. They can override the protections in the provincial policy statement. For example, protections for provincially significant wetlands. Had a huge fight about that in the GTA around the Pickering wetland. I don't know if you heard about that one, but we won.
We did win.
There's a lot of fighting, and it wasn't just Ontario Nature. I mean, well, we went to court. The local affected First Nation went to court, but we also had a ton of people protesting, on the streets, protesting for months and months and months. And finally, the
advocacy was successful.
We were successful, but we were only successful because the developer pulled out. So then the government decided it would revoke the MZO. Okay. Anyway, so it has nothing to do with the federal government, really, an MZO. It comes from the Minister of Municipal Affairs and Housing in Ontario.
Okay. Okay, thanks. There's a bit of a conversation going on, again, I guess to Anne a bit, perhaps on this one. There's Suzanne and others are commenting about how there needs to be more kind of general knowledge, awareness, advertising about the benefits and value and importance of wetlands, education, rather than fixing damage, but really getting out in front of it. And I'm wondering, and I think Leigh's also asking, have there been Ontario nature campaigns that you've seen that we should know about, things that we could do here, particularly around this education and kind of conservation focus and push?
Yeah, I mean, the wetland campaigning at Ontario Nature has been going on for decades, long before my time. And it's certainly an important aspect of the work that I do, which is why I'm here tonight, because it's part of our strategic plan, and wetlands are so important to biodiversity and so on. If you'd like to follow issues as they emerge, then I'd strongly recommend that you sign up for our action alerts, and then you get hooked into these issues as they arise. So, for instance, we've had an action alert that's garnered thousands of responses, which means thousands of letters going out to politicians and decision makers about minister zoning orders and about wetlands and about the two of them, the intersection of both. So it's a good way to just stay connected. And so you go on to ontarionature.org and you look under the take action thing, and you'll find a way to sign up for action alerts, but that's a good way to find out what's going on. We do weekly blogs. We have our quarterly magazine, and those are also part of our education tools to really reach out on these issues. When I was listening to Erik talk about what they're doing about tile draining, my mind immediately went to, oh, that would be something that we could maybe do a blog about, because the fact that your conservation authority, Erik, is doing this and other conservation authorities aren't, and the impacts of drainage, we need to raise awareness about that. So maybe we can work together and try to get the word out a little more, because it sounds like a really good policy that you've got going there, and we need to spread that practice around by the sounds of it.
Sounds like a lot of getting the word out and knowledge sharing and education is on the agenda, certainly. Does the EBC ensure that carbon credits being attributed to the lands under control are only counted once? If so, how are you ensuring this?
We hire experts to measure how much carbon is being absorbed, and there's all sorts of things they subtract for leakage and potential problems. At any rate, then we have to have a verifier come and verify that those calculations are accurate. And then we have to register our offsets with the Canadian Standards Association so that they are only counted once.
Okay, there you go. That's a pretty strict process.
It's a very strict process.
So could that assessment also be used for municipalities who want to understand what their carbon sequestration capacity, the current capacity of their carbon sequestration? Certainly,
yeah. We've got the experts in hand who can do that, and yeah, we would appreciate the opportunity to help with things like that, certainly.
Okay, thank you. There's a question about whether do you know if the use of swales in permaculture has an effect on wetlands?
I think I told Rosemary everything she probably wants to know and more. I have a swale myself. They're not a panacea for everything, but I think it would be tough to argue that swales harm wetlands in any way.
And it sounds like some dusting off of the wetland conservation strategy needs to happen to help save one of our great resources. Anne
has her hand up.
Yeah. I just wanted to say, Jenny, from my perspective, like this is an election year, both municipal and provincial. So we need to keep wetlands in mind when we vote. You know, if candidates come to your door, just raise the issue. Let them know that you care, that it matters, that it's crazy that we're losing them, need to be protected. Watch what candidates are saying and challenge them. I mean, we can't really afford to have anti-environment people representing us in municipal governments or in provincial governments. It's just, we can't afford it anymore. Can't afford it in a dollar sense. We can't afford it in any sense. So that's a huge opportunity for us this year to make our votes really count. Vote for nature.
I was literally just about to say the exact same thing, that, you know, it's provincial election is coming up. Ask the candidates, you know, tell them about your concern over that and put a vote. Yeah, put a vote to nature, just like Anne said. I'm just about to put a link in the chat here. And I just wanted to mention too that Diane Sachs, who's the former environmental commissioner, had done a number of reports, and when the new provincial government came in, a lot of them were removed and taken off the website. Diane Sachs has taken it to just, you know, still make them available through her own platform and her own website. And I just posted a report there because it talks heavily about wetlands and what needs to be done, that, you know, there's so few left. Like, there needs to be better conservation measures. Why is it that you have to prove a wetland is provincially significant in order not to be altered? Shouldn't we just assume they're all significant, given we don't have many in Southern Ontario? And then also thinking that, you know, the measures we have in Southern Ontario often apply for Northern Ontario, and think of the vast peatland that exists there now, and mining proposals for up there. So yeah, the list goes on, but yeah, I'll just put that up. I will put that report there, and in case anybody is interested in taking a look at it, because I find it a good report, because it's an independent outsider assessment of the conservation situation in Ontario.
Bob, do you want to say anything more about that, or Eric? It seems like this is like something that needs to be top of mind for all of us, is the value and the service that wetlands do and the conservation that's needed. Anything you want to add before we close?
Very locally, some policies that'll be coming around very shortly will be the updates to the Saugeen's planning and regs policies, which will be made public, put on our website, notified via our board packages and board meetings, and presumably a media release or something along the lines. So definitely keep your ear to the ground on very, very local policies that'll definitely influence the wetland, maybe in your backyard, or if you're living in South Grey and Bruce. And the more the merrier on voices that, again, will balance out that what can sometimes be pro-development cry that the board hears. You know, we need, and it's good to strike that balance, and appreciate any help we can get there when the time comes.
We might need to make some noise. Bob, anything about conservation? Any other pieces to add? You've been hugely helpful around that we need to attend.
No, it's useful to get together and try to plan a town hall and ask the candidates to come, and then you've got the ability to ask them questions, and you can embarrass them a little, you know. So certainly attend any of these all candidates meetings and raise your hand and get in there.
I was wondering, Anne, whether you want to make a comment about what's going on from GB Can, which is our Grey Bruce Climate Action Network, in relation to the municipality and pushing the climate agenda big time.
Hi there, I'm busy knitting and listening. And it's been a really, really interesting evening. Thank you very much to all four of the presenters. I really enjoyed it. So we've got two working groups from GB Can, and GB Can is the Grey Bruce Climate Action Network, which represents all of the climate action teams throughout Grey and Bruce. And actually, I think we're starting to move a bit out of Gray and Bruce as well. And one of the things that they are working on is getting ready for the elections coming up, both provincial and municipal. And we have one group that is working on developing more of a checklist of milestones that municipalities could be reaching around their climate action activities. And actually Jenny is part of that group. The other group is really focusing on trying to attract good candidates and how to figure out whether those candidates or the candidate that you're wanting to support is actually able to do good governance, work from that perspective, but do it through a climate lens. And so we've developed a job description for what candidates need to be able to do and the skills they need to bring to the job. But we're also trying to generate questions that can be used in the all candidates meetings, can be used individually, can be used in interviews that could be shared with the press or in public media, so that kind of just generally people get a sense of who these constituents are and whether you want to vote for them. Are they, are they climate sensitive? Are they going to do their job with a climate lens focus and do what we would like them to do? The other thing we're trying to put in place, and this is throughout the whole region, is if a good candidate is attracted, that we will support them in their campaign, but we will also look at creating a support team for them once they're elected, because it can be a really tough job, particularly if you end up being the sole climate champion on a council. So to have some people kind of backing them up, supporting them can be really useful.
So there is work going on. Stay tuned on that and get involved with your local climate action team if you want to be equipped to really ask some pointed questions around where people stand on climate and in particular on the carbon sequestration potential of our wetlands. I think is a really important piece of that.
Yes, thanks very much, and Jenny to hone in on the politics, the local politics, municipal politics, and provincial politics at the end of this. Interesting how this evening went, right? This climate forum is about knowledge sharing, and we dove really deep into the science of wetland, the aesthetics of it, the biosphere, all the good stuff that come out of wetlands, and the bad stuff that we do to them. So it was interesting that this range from the science to the political. It's a tough one. We can't chain ourselves really to wetlands, can we? We can chain ourselves to trees, but not to wetlands so easily. But we need to really, really protect them. And it's fascinating how this works here, because we still have a narrative for wetlands. We can see them. We have stories about them. I'm from Germany. I've never seen wetlands there. Came here in 1985. So it was a fascinating new landscape for me to get into. And it is important that we protect it and that we keep our ears open where politics, the MZOs and so on, threaten them. So anyway, thanks everybody for coming tonight. Thanks very much to the presenters, to Amanda and Erik and Bob. You did an amazing job. It was just great to hear you and how everybody connected, the audience connected with you, you connected with each other. It was a great evening.
It was busy. It was busy.
Yeah, very, very busy.
Great, that's good.
Yeah, and just by the way, there will be an Earth Day on April the 23rd. I'm one of the organizers, and I think I will approach some of you speakers if you would like to present something there, but that's for another time.
Next Thursday is March 17th, so you can save that date. We're going to talk about collaborative solutions to climate change. So what spurred this on is Glassworks Co-op, who is working hard to create a co-housing and a community garden lot in downtown Owen Sound. They'll be featured next month with us. And we also realize that there's other examples around the community of not only collaborative housing, but collaborative farming. And there's some pretty important, local, relevant climate solutions in both of those. So stay tuned on March 17th, and I'll put the link in the chat on how you can get notified about that.
Thanks, everybody. What a pleasure to have such a large group here tonight and great speakers. Conservation.
Thank you to Anne and Bob and Eric and Amanda. I appreciate it.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.